toxic. As you can see, we're a little bit hybrid. I think we have one person in the audience today, but we are mainly still Zoom. So we will have one more in this series of our hybrid/virtual, which will be on May 12th. It's going to be facilitated by the DNA Sequencing Corps. They will have a guest speaker from Mira Genomics. So we will find out more details about that starting next week. But this afternoon, we have the pleasure of having Dale Scheller and Michelle Chavelli, who are from the UW-BC Isotope Ratio Mass Spec Lab. We're going to be talking about a new fascinating study that they've been a part of. So I will let them take it away. We're going to do a quick mic swap first. So thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Liz. So today, Michelle and I will swap back and forth a little bit on the presentation. We will discuss our general capabilities in the isotope ratio lab, and then some of the applications that we've been involved in, with special emphasis on a recent study that we've worked with in collaboration with the University of Chicago Sleep Lab on the effect of sleep and weight management. So let's start with a little bit of general background on stable isotopes. We work with both natural abundance measurements of heavy and light isotopes of the light elements from hydrogen through sulfur. In each of those cases, well, the five elements presented here: hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, no glasses, oxygen, and sulfur. Sulfur we don't work with personally, but most people with the light elements do. They each have a major isotope, usually the light isotope of the pair, which makes up more than 99% of the pool of that element on our Earth. And the heavy isotope, the rare isotope, which makes up anywhere between a very small fraction of that element and about 1%. So in the case of hydrogen, all right, better put these on. The deuterium isotope makes up about 0.01% of the hydrogen on our Earth, and 99.98 is present only as the protium form of hydrogen. In the case of carbon, about 1% is the heavy isotope, 99% the light isotope. Nitrogen, a little less abundant than carbon, in terms of about 0.3% of it being the heavy isotope, 99.7% being the light isotope. Oxygen's unusual of this group in that there are three stable isotopes, non-radioactive isotopes available. The oxygen-18, the most abundant, makes up over 99% of the pool on Earth. And the oxygen-17, very small fraction, 0.03%. And oxygen-18, about 0.2%. What's interesting about these isotopes is that they vary a little bit in nature, and it's possible to measure that variation, which Michelle will talk about a little bit more. But to make those measurements, we use isotope ratio mass spectrometry, which lets us measure, or allows us to measure, the ratio of the heavy isotope to the light isotope with amazing precision. In the case of carbon, let's say we have two samples. One that has a ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 of 0.011230. And the second one having a little less of that stable isotope, carbon-13, so the ratio is about 0.011210, only differing down here in the fifth decimal place. But that's quite easily measured by isotope ratio mass spectrometry. But to talk about that, rather than trying to publish these numbers, these ratio numbers, we use a stable isotope technique and present the results in terms of the del per mil, which is calculated from the ratio in the sample divided by the ratio of the heavy to the light isotope in an international standard. In the case of carbon, it's PDB belemnite limestone. Take the ratio of those ratios, subtract 1, and multiply by 1,000 to get nice unit numbers which one can talk about and publish. The example here, sample 1 is about 0.6 per mil less abundant in carbon-13 than the PDB standard, and sample 2 about 2.4 per mil less abundant in carbon-13. So we talk about them as being lighter groups of carbon. The isotope, an example of an isotope ratio mass spectrometer is shown here. It's the Delta 5 series. It has a rather unremarkable low mass range, or a range. It's not very large. It can only measure mass to charge ratio ions between 1 and about 70. So it covers things from hydrogen through sulfur dioxide. But as I pointed out in the last slides, its ability to measure those ratios of the heavy to light isotope is extremely sensitive. A cartoon of an isotope ratio mass spec is shown here. Like all mass specs, there's an ion source, which ionizes the sample of interest. That's accelerated out through, in this case, a magnet. And a moving ion moving through a magnetic field will follow a curved trajectory and bend. And in the case of carbon dioxide, if we're interested in measuring the carbon-13 or oxygen-18 isotope ratio in that carbon dioxide, those three mass units, the 44, 45, and 46 for O18, 45 for carbon-13, 44 for carbon-12, are focused on Faraday cup collectors. Most mass spectrometers use an amplifier here instead of a Faraday cup collector. But the Faraday cup collector is more stable, so it just does not amplify that ion current that's striking it, but that current then is flowed through an amplifier and fed into a computer to log the data and calculate the per mil difference between the heavy and light isotopes. What's key in the isotope ratio mass spectrometer in terms of utility are the inlets. They can be quite varied. What we have available to us is a gas bench, which can introduce a gas from a glass tube with a septum top. We also have a dual gas inlet, so we can introduce both a known reference standard and the unknown gas. An elemental analyzer, which can convert a dry, solid material into carbon dioxide, nitrogen gas, and then flow that into the isotope ratio mass spec. Or a chromium reduction furnace, which is valuable for converting water into hydrogen gas, which can then be introduced to the isotope ratio mass spec. The natural abundance, the normal variation between the heavy and light isotope creates some interesting biomarkers which can be used for human research into diet. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Scheller. So, as Dr. Scheller described, the high precision of the IRMS devices allow us measuring slightly differences in the isotope abundances. So we can use the isotope signature of products as to measure the differences in these products. An example is given by the difference in the isotopic signal from plants that has the C3 photosynthesis cycle, which discriminates the carbon-13 against the carbon-12 from the carbon dioxide from the air. So this carbon-13 in the C3 plants is lighter than the carbon-13 found in C4 plants. This can be used as biomarkers to measure the amount of carbohydrate that comes from plants from the C4 photosynthesis cycles, as corn and sugar cane. So another potential natural biomarker is the nitrogen 15, which gradually increases these values within the tropic level of the food chain. So when an animal consumes the nitrogen from plants, the nitrogen in plants is incorporated in the protein tissues of these animals. So the animal's protein metabolism, they generate and eliminate the nitrogen, and this process has a higher preference for the excretion of nitrogen 14, which is the lighter nitrogen. So when we analyze the isotope operation for nitrogen 15, the higher value of nitrogen 15 is related with the protein sources of the products. So considering you have stable isotopes as potential biomarkers of food consumption, we can give attention to the accuracy of measurement, the food intake in the population. So currently, we don't have a very precise or accurate method to analyze the association between diet and disease in population level. Mainly because the currently diet assessment tools is based on self-reports. So this methodology relies on errors and biases that is associated with the self-report condition. So validation studies of food consumptions used a gold standard method to prove these inaccuracies in self-report dietary questionnaires, and also they showed us that these inaccuracies occur independently of the BMI of the population. So stable isotopes can be used as biomarkers of diet. So in this case, a very well-controlled study showed us that the carbon-13 isotope operation is associated with the consumption of meat and also sugar-sweetened beverages, while nitrogen-15 isotope ratio is associated with the consumption of fish and meat. Besides the natural stable isotopes that we can find in the environment, we can also see labeled compounds which are produced by the industries. So these compounds are widely used in many research fields, which is life science, food and medicine, agriculture, environment, and geology, and others fields. An example of the use of enriched compound is the carbon-13 brief test, on which we can use this compound to analyze and to diagnose the presence of H. pylori in the human stomach. So this H. pylori produces a urease compound which catabolizes the carbon-13 in the labeled compound. This carbon-13 will circulate in the bloodstream as bicarbonate and will be released by lungs as carbon dioxide. So the IRMS will analyze this gas. Its results will be analyzed by the doctors, and he will provide the last diagnosis of the presence or not of this bacteria. Another very important labeled compound is the double-labeled water, which is a compound that we are using in the energy metabolism researches. So this product will be further discussed by Dr. Dale Scheller.
Thank you, Michelle. Oops. So the doubly labeled water method is a fascinating but rather simple in theory method for measuring energy metabolism or energy expenditure in a mammalian system. In this case, the human mammal drinks water labeled with deuterium and oxygen 18. Over the next 2 to 3 hours, that readily mixes across the body water pool, entering first into the bloodstream and then into the intracellular spaces. And then for the next 2 to 3 weeks, one can watch that spike of deuterium and oxygen 18 exit the body. The deuterium exits the body in the form of water excreted in urine, sweat, breath vapor, and it's replaced by new water intake that's unlabeled. You'll notice that the enrichment of the deuterium goes down over time, and one can measure that decay rate, that elimination rate. The oxygen 18, on the other hand, is eliminated both as water, just like the hydrogen deuterium was, but also it exchanges into carbon dioxide as the body produces that. So it's eliminated faster than the deuterium. The difference between the two elimination rates of those two isotopes is a measure of CO2 production. That, of course, is the end product of respiration. So from that, you can calculate how many calories the individual burned over that period of 5 to 3 weeks. The method was actually invented more than 50 years ago by Nate Lifson, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. And it came from his study of trying to figure out where the oxygens in carbon dioxide came from. He exposed rats to oxygen 18 labeled air, and if the oxygens came directly from the air, you'd expect the O18 to show up in the expired CO2. What he found instead was that the CO2 was initially unlabeled and then slowly gained in O18 labeling over time, indicating that what was happening was the oxygen in CO2 was coming not from air directly, but rather coming from exchange with body water. And that gave him the idea to use the doubly labeled water as a measure of CO2 production. And he in 1957 first validated the use of doubly labeled water in rats and found that it was accurate for the measurement of CO2 production with an error, well, with an accuracy of 3% and a precision of about 3%. The doses he used at this time, because he didn't have available to him an isotope ratio mass spectrometer, he had to use a less precise mass spec technique, were rather high. And to scale up this technique using general forms of mass spectrometry would have cost about $50,000 per dose of doubly labeled water. A little high for even NIH to say, oh, we need that method. But during the 1960s, Nate Lifson met Dr. Alfred Neer, a physicist at the University of Minnesota, who was building an isotope ratio mass spectrometer. So Lifson and his students did a validation study using much smaller and more affordable doses of doubly labeled water. Unfortunately, Dr. Neer's new isotope ratio mass spec never quite worked. And any of you who've collaborated with someone else know that sometimes Every time you call them up, they'll say, we're having a little problem yet, but by next month we should have your project done. Well, he never did get it done over the next year and a half, which for me was quite fortunate because in 1986, when I discovered Nate Lifson's idea for using doubly labeled water to measure energy expenditure, myself and Edzard van Santen, working in our lab, were the first to validate the use of doubly labeled water for measuring energy expenditure in humans. We did a small study, 4 subjects. We found it to be accurate to 2% with a precision of about 6%. Other groups across the world have also done validation studies of the use of doubly labeled water. And those studies were recently collected by Dr. Speakman, who did a meta-analysis. And there are about 10 validation studies that have been done with a total of about 61 subjects. And he was able to refine the calculation and show that doubly labeled water could measure energy expenditure with an accuracy of less than 0.5% and a precision across multiple labs of 7.6%. Not surprisingly, since 1986, that method has been applied in many studies, and turn it back over to Michelle to talk about some of those applications.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Scheller. So, considering that double labeled water is a high precision and accurate method to measure total energy expenditure in free living conditions, we can use this technique to answer questions related to obesity. So the first data evaluating weight for similar high were obtained from army records from 1850s until 1960s, and after that, national surveys start to be conducted. So unifying this data, we can see an exponential growth of the weight, which is similar to the exponential growth of obesity and overweight in the population. So the epidemiologists who worked with this surveys observed that part of a subgroup of the obesity group showed a lower self-reported energy intake when compared to the lean group. And the scientists highlight the hypothesis that the obesity could be caused by metabolic or behavioral defects that can lead to a decrease in the energy expenditure. So, however, Prentice and his colleagues applied the double labeled water to test this hypothesis, and they refuted it. So they showed that the group who present a high BMI had, in fact, a higher energy expenditure when compared to the group that is lean body mass index. They also confirmed the self-reported energy intakes tools are also inaccurate to measure the energy intake. So another great applicability of double labeled water can be measuring the energy intake based on the principle of energy balance. So the energy intake must equal total energy expended plus the differences in the energy stores. So if we measure the fat mass and the fat-free mass across time, we are allowed to calculate the energy stores, multiplying the differences in the tissues, in the fat mass and in the fat-free mass across time by their energy density. So the review study that Dr. Scheller and I conducted on validation studies to verify the accuracy of this methodology, we realized that this technique can be 2% accurate and 7% precise to measure the total energy the energy consumption of the individuals. And the propagation of error analysis showed us the precision range between 4 to 37%. So this range is due to the methods of assessment of energy store and also total energy expenditure, and also due to the interval between the energy store measurements. So the reproducibility of DEXA measurements is limited when it's occurred in a period of time shorter than 2 weeks. 3 weeks could show us a better accuracy. However, when this is applied in 3 weeks in subjects that has a fast turnover, water turnover, it will limit the application of double-labeled water. So based on the obesity, it's become a pandemic due to the obesogenic environment. The CDC guidelines for achieving and maintaining a health weight state that we have 3 main factors, which are health eating, physical activity, and optimal sleep. So it is well established that diet and physical activity influences the energy balance. In this scenario, a person who intake a high amount of energy and expend a low amount of energy in the physical activity can have an energy imbalance and then again weight. The inverse condition is also true. However, it is not intuitive. The reason why the sleep also influences the weight change. So to answer these questions, Dr. Scheller will further explain us the influence of this factor in the weight changes.
So sleep shows up on the CDC guidelines for weight maintenance because of large epidemiologic studies which have shown an association between the length of time that individuals sleep on average and their body mass index, or how much excess weight they're carrying. Here's one example where in the study group, a small percentage of those who were studied slept on average less than 5 hours per night as self-reported, and they had the highest BMI in the group that was being surveyed. And as sleep increased from 5 to 6 hours to 6 to 7 hours a night, 7 to 8 as reported, or between 8 and 9, BMI decreased. And with longer sleep times, it starts to increase again, thus showing that there is some relationship between typical sleep time, or average sleep time, and excess body weight, so that short sleepers are more likely to be obese. In addition to those epidemiologic studies, people started doing laboratory studies where the volunteers came into the lab and were then deprived of sleep for 1 or 4 nights, up to 4 nights, where they were limited to about 4 hours of sleep a night and then forced to get up. And after they did that, the next morning or the next day, they measured their caloric intake. The subjects were fed a cafeteria diet from a buffet line and could select as much as they want. And in randomized controls, in which intake in an individual was measured after a full night's sleep of 7 to 8 hours, and after only 4 nights, they ate about 300 calories more during that buffet diet. In non-randomized controls, similar results, but a little bit different. Just about 400 calories a day more after the short sleep. As part of those studies, they started to look at the mechanisms of that, and what was noticed is that circulating hunger and satiety hormones, leptin decreased after short sleep, and ghrelin increased, which act together to induce the individual to be hungrier and thus eat more. In addition, there are other factors which are affected by the actions of leptin and ghrelin, which feed back to increase the reward mechanism for food. When reward mechanisms, I explain it rather simply. It's kind of like when you're in grade school, getting a gold star on your homework report. You get that reward, so you smile a bit. Well, here it increases hedonic eating, so a piece of chocolate cake gives you a good feeling and causes you to smile a little bit. We were approached by Ezra Tassali at the University of Chicago to kind of take this further and to test whether or not reversing that short sleep habit in individuals would cause them to eat less or change their energy expenditure and thus change their energy balance between intake and expenditure, leading to weight loss in this case. But the aims were to test which is more important, the energy expenditure term, might be affected by sleep changes, and the energy intake term. She recruited 80 subjects who participated in a randomized study. Inclusion criteria included an age between 21 and 40, a BMI in the overweight category, greater than or equal to 25 kilograms per meter squared, up to 29.9, and excluded subjects who had some reason for short sleep, such as obstructive sleep apnea, insomnia, or a history of other sleeping disorders, or had been involved in sleep work and shift work during the last 2 years. The characteristics of those 80 subjects, which were divided at the randomization stage between 40 who were control group, no change in sleep, and 40 who were encouraged to extend their bedtime and thus increase their sleep time. Ages were matched between the two groups. Sexes were about equal division between males and females in both groups. BMI by entry criteria were in the overweight category. But also race and ethnicity, I should say, were about equally divided between the two groups, where about half the subjects were white and the other half minority groups. And although not included in the recruitment inclusion or exclusion techniques, about half the subjects engaged in a moderate amount, more than 90 minutes per week of moderate exercise. And the sleep averaged of these two groups about 6 hours a night. Again, well matched between the two groups. The design of the study is shown here. All 80 subjects first began a period of habitual sleep, which lasted for 2 weeks, where they were monitored in terms of wearing a wrist tigograph, which reports to sleep. And it turns out that when a person falls asleep, they move their hands less than when they're awake. So there's a quiet period on the wrist monitor, which is interpreted as sleeping. That was then worn every day. Their energy expenditure was measured by doubly labeled water, which was measured over 14 days during the habitual phase, and then a second dose of doubly labeled water was administered, and their energy expenditure was measured over the period where they were randomized to either sleep elongation or habitual sleep. Energy intake was measured by the combination of energy expenditure from doubly labeled water and change in body energy stores by DEXA. Also measured then, their resting metabolic rate by indirect calorimetry, and questionnaires were administered during the last day of the study to see how they felt about the changes in their sleep pattern. The randomization was done on day 15, and after being, those that were randomized to the sleep elongation spent an hour and a half with an individual session with Dr. Tasali, who began to identify in a conversation mode with them what factors in their lifestyle were currently limiting their sleep duration to about 6 hours a night, and how they could change that to elongate their time in bed to 8 hours. And the general theme of all of these 40 subjects that were in the sleep elongation arm was that they needed to make some changes in their lifestyle, such as turning off all electronics at bedtime, and also establish a quiet period of about a half an hour before bedtime so they wouldn't go out jogging or they wouldn't be watching exciting things on TV or surfing the internet, and thus we're prepared for now spending 8 hours a night in bed and sleeping. The sleep times are shown here. In the upper panel is the habitual group, and after the first 14 days, the average sleep time was about 6 hours a night and didn't change in the second 14 days. In comparison to that, though, the sleep elongation group dramatically increased their sleep time on day 15 after they were randomized to sleep elongation, so that on average, that group increased their sleep time by 1.2 hours per night, which was significant. Other results from that are shown here. I'm not used to not being able to point at the results very well, but the sleep elongation group is on the left side, the control group on the right side. The sleep time, you can see, increased in the elongation group, didn't change in the habitual group. Energy intake, though, was the big surprise for us. Energy intake decreased in the subjects that were randomized to sleep elongation, and actually increased a little bit in the control group. Total energy expenditure hardly changed. So there was a change in energy balance in these individuals, largely due to increased energy intake. It has influenced about 12% of a change in energy expenditure. The change in energy expenditure did not show up as a statistically significant change in resting metabolic rate, but other studies, if we sort of have started to look at the change in resting metabolic rate, and do find a slight decrease with sleep elongation or an increase with sleep deprivation. Thermic effect of meals, which was measured in Dr. Tasali's study, did not change at all. And activity energy expenditure showed a slight sleep elongation treatment effect to decrease, but it was not statistically significant. The change in energy intake is shown here on this slide. The overall treatment effect, as I just said, was 270 calories a day, which is not a small. It's about 5 Oreo cookies or about a piece of buttered toast and jelly. In the control group, the intake tended to increase a little bit in the second week, as shown here, and you can see them going up and down. Whereas in the sleep elongation group, there was a decrease in energy intake. Rather consistent across the study, with the vast majority of the individuals increasing their intake. It's a little noisy, but that's largely due to the method of using DEXA to measure change in energy stores. That is not extremely, it has good precision, but not perfect precision for trying to measure change in energy stores over a 2-week period. What was interesting, though, is that there was a good correlation between change in sleep duration in all the subjects, all 80 subjects, and change in energy intake, showing that intake decreased with increasing sleep duration. The conclusions from this study are that A, we could convince subjects who slept on average less than 6.5 hours per night to increase their sleep time with only a 1.5 hour individualized meeting with Dr. Tasali. And the rather surprising result is that the sleep elongation had a dramatic increase or decrease in energy intake, even though the subjects had not been told we were trying to assess their energy intake. This happened without their knowledge of that, so it wasn't a biased result on the part of the subjects. It's also interesting to note that the change in energy intake was similar, but in the opposite direction to that which has been measured in laboratory conditions. I should offer here that this sleep study was done at the subject's home. They were not in the laboratory for this 4-week period, but they went home and were living at home under the normal lifestyle conditions, except for the change in sleep hygiene. But the similarities between these two opposite effects suggests that the sleep deprivation effect, which has been well documented in short intervention studies, proceeds and stays with these subjects who were sleep deprived at over at least a 5 to 6 week period, including the laid-in and then the 4-week study period. And that it reverses quickly after the individuals lengthen their sleep time, and it occurs in a real-life situation and not just in a laboratory condition where they might be changing their behavior a little bit because they know they're being watched. This predicts that improvement in sleep duration, moving people from short sleep to a healthy sleep time of 7 to 9 hours, should help those individuals lose weight. That, however, though, still has to be tested in an efficacy study. Just to sum up, though, our isotope ratio lab, we are here on campus. We offer on-campus expertise in bioenergetics. We provide fee-for-service access to IRMS analyses, which are available globally if people come and are willing to pay the fee-for-service. The key assays that we offer, which are not available except at a handful of laboratories across the globe, are the measurement of total energy expenditure by doubly labeled water, measurement of energy intake by a combination of doubly labeled water plus change in body energy stores, and we also have been involved in and do continue to stay involved with some biomarker studies of dietary intake. Oops. Thank you.
I have one question so far, and that is, why did the energy intake of the control group go up?
Okay.
Take 2. All right. So why did the energy intake of the control group go up if they simply continued to not have a good sleep duration, for example, without changing things?
Can't tell you for sure, but it's not an unusual observation. When people enter into a study, even though they were not told that we were measuring their energy intake, they did know they were being weighed. So knowing that their weight would be recorded every day on a Wi-Fi connected home scale, they probably thought a little bit about what they should and shouldn't be eating and probably changed a little bit, but that wears off as time goes on. It's a likely explanation, but can't say for sure. It's been seen in other studies.
Any additional questions from the Zoom? Feel free to put them in the chat and I will relay them. Or from our audience member. You're getting some applause and some hearts in the chat and some thank yous in the chat.
It's good to know people are still online.
Let's see. Maybe we'll give about, oh, here we go. Another question. If the patients sleep longer, they have less time to eat stuff. How about that?
It's a possibility, but it's also that one of the effects of sleep deprivation is that it sort of activates your brain to try to stay awake, and one of the things that you do when you try to stay awake is eat. So it could be that, but yes, it is longer. You express the number of calories consumed per hour of wakefulness. There's still a difference between the two groups, but it's not as large.
Yeah, I have a quick question for you. So regarding individuals, let's say who have cancer and they're going through chemotherapy, individuals who have come out with a positive outcome, have they been compared regarding the energy intake and use compared to individuals who have had a negative outcome? Has there been studies related to that?
Okay, so the question from the audience was, subjects who are suffering from cancer and undergoing treatment, there's a diversity of responses. Some patients, unfortunately, don't respond well to the treatment and do not survive the cancer. Others do. Have investigators looked at the effect of both the quality and quantity of food that they consume during treatment? Does that influence the outcome? I have not reviewed that literature in detail, although I've been one of those subjects. Those that really shut down their eating do not do as well. Cachexia, cancer cachexia, where there's a dramatic decrease in total caloric intake, does worsen the outcome. Whether or not there's a graded response as one goes through from dramatically undereating to getting up to normal levels, I don't know, because I just haven't looked at the literature.
We have a few more questions. One question is, you indicated that N15 is differentially retained in the body. Is it the same situation for other isotopes like C13 or deuterium?
Yes, the metabolism, they have a preference to keep the heavy isotopes in body and release the light isotopes. So we have this possibility to measure the heavy isotopes related to the its consumption.
Nitrogen gives one of the larger signals, though, from trophic level, because it's turned over so frequently during the day.
And another question is, reduced sleep can cause stress, example, cortisol levels. Has any work been done looking at the stress hormone levels?
Yes, and indeed, there is a stress response, so sleep deprivation is considered because of that. It's one of many stresses of life. But, there are a large number of changes in feedback mechanisms involved in hunger and satiety.
And just kind of a clarification that this was purely a measure of energy intake and outtake and how that changes with more sleep.
Yes, indeed, it's an objective, and we know from validation studies that both double label water for measuring energy expenditure and the combined technique are accurate and have been validated.
Wait, one more. Let's see. Okay. Got a lot of very interesting from the chat, and a couple more thank yous from the chat.
Okay.
Couple more seconds for any questions from the Zoom. Okay, question is, should ER doctors stop being on 24-hour shift?
Well, yes, because it is a stressor. It does cause overeating in many individuals. But the overeating is not the only effect of that stress. I was involved 25 years ago with Dr. Rechtschaffen, who was working with total sleep deprivation in rats. And actually, when in a rat, once you sleep deprive them of all sleep, or even REM sleep for weeks at a time, the outcome is death. So it's not good for you.
Okay, I think we have all the questions from the chat in the Zoom.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.